Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of A Idle Podcast, the podcast where I do weekly book reviews. This week, I read The President and the Freedom Fighter, Abraham Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, and Their Battle to Save America's Soul by Brian Kilmeade. Released in 2021, this book is about Lincoln and Douglass's proximity to the executive office, abolitionism, and the Civil War. In the early 1860s, the U.S. experienced a deep division surrounding the issues of federal power and the president's role in freeing those that were enslaved. The first section of the book is titled The Preamble, which kind of acts as an introduction. Included is a quote as follows: "The job of guiding the nation to a fairer future fell to these two remarkable Americans." So that kind of sets the stakes for the audience. It paints the picture that we are about to gain more insight on as far as these two are concerned in their character. So let's start with a little bit of background information. First of all, Abraham Lincoln became the president who ultimately freed the enslaved people during the U.S. Civil War. The book opens with a story about how he saved a drowning boat in 1931, and this is about 30 years before he actually became president. But what this story does is it shows his keen and intelligence and his character early on so that we know what type of person he is and that he has a different quality that will eventually set him apart from his peers. We also get an explanation on his upbringing. He had zero formal education. I mean, he probably went a few times, but he really had to work for the family. And that work was actual labor. And so he did what he had to do with his father to provide for their family and make sure they survived. So he really wasn't as educated in the school system. Well, I don't think it could be called a system at that time, but he wasn't going to school. So everything that we learn and how he ultimately becomes this politician, a lawyer, someone who influences people, that is attributed to him, his ambition and wanting to learn. And what this does is it sets up a segue for Douglass's introduction, because if you are not aware, Frederick Douglass was enslaved in Maryland. And so his education, he wasn't afforded that opportunity. So he obviously had zero. And he ended up teaching himself how to read and how to write, just looking at different signs and copying them. And he went on to use his story to expose the horrors of slavery and speak against it. Now, he escaped and settled in the North and ultimately became kind of an abolitionist head of state. He was someone who held great influence and who spread the word quite literally with his speeches to different areas. And so he was very important to the movement during that time period. And he went on to author the North Star, which is a newspaper, which this is a testament to his character because, again, growing up enslaved, he wasn't afforded even a second thought of an education. It was actually forbidden. And so for him to grow into this man that not only taught himself how to read and write, taught himself, comprehension, he went on to author this newspaper that became a key role in getting the ideas of the abolitionists out there. And the two main things you really have to understand here is, one, the U.S. Civil War. It's explained in depth here, and it's eventually it started when the southern states seceded and formed the Confederacy. And the Civil War took place between 1861 and 1865. Another key event, I guess this is an event, is the Emancipation Proclamation, which was issued by Lincoln as a preliminary September 22nd, 1862. But the final version was signed by Lincoln January 1st, 1863. And that's kind of where the legal enforcement was supposed to start for everyone. And it did for the majority of people, but these things take time to actually enforce, and also note that the war hadn't ended at that point. So, okay, so with themes here, there's two major ones, but I first want to talk about the one that may not seem as obvious here. So, the art of oration. So, oration is an orator is someone who is skilled and eloquent in public speaking. What we found is that if you look at just the career path of Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln, you know that they were both skilled orators, and they had their different approaches of how they prepared for speeches, of what they were going for, of the length, of, all that good stuff. But it boils down to that was a great skill that they were able to tap into and utilize for their own beliefs and ideologies. And so that's a very important skill that, let me tell you something, not a lot of people in this world have it. Just because you can form a sentence does not mean you are a good public speaker. But I don't want to get off topic here. So under this, of course, is the Columbian Orator, which was published in 1797 by Caleb Bingham. And this stuck out to me because they both owned a copy. Both Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln owned a copy of this, and I looked it up, and it's basically a collection of different speeches, dialogues, essays, different writings. And what you can get from this as someone who aims to be a better orator is you can see how people in the past have done it. You can see great works of how people maybe structured a narrative, even if you're giving a speech. The importance obviously here would be the beginning, the middle, the end. How you end a lot of the time sticks with people. If you're going to include repetition, a lot of the speeches that we now know and can recite are because figures have used repetition in it. So understanding how to frame stuff and then how to, actually speak it. So they both owned a copy and learned from it and read it. And that was kind of their study guide, because again, we're talking about two figures that did not have a formal education, and they chose to read the Columbian Orator, which I have a copy online, but I don't know if I was able to find like a physical book. I like physical books if I can get them, but I was able to download, I guess because it's considered like an academic journal, so I was able to download it through one of the schools. But okay, next, obviously, when we're talking about oration, is speeches. So like I said just a moment ago, this became a tool for Frederick Douglass post-enslavement. It also became a moneymaker for him, which is big because he was making money when he was enslaved and doing all that labor, but it just wasn't going to him. So this served as something that could financially benefit him and his family, but he also was able to use it to spread abolition points. And as far as Lincoln goes, obviously when we're talking politicians, and it wasn't as big back then, but it was still important for the president to be able to carry himself in a way that he could address crowds of people and, have it together and not kind of look like a fool. And so one key thing for him was that he used his speeches to rally the Union troops, because there were a lot of points in the Civil War when the Union was not doing good at all. And also with Lincoln, so he had a career in litigation. He was a lawyer, and this is it served as an early pathway to politics for Lincoln, but it also gave him a space to practice his public speaking and how to, I don't want to say sway because that sounds deceitful, but how to get your point across so that someone understands it. And that reinforced his name, Honest Abe. So he had the name Honest Abe because people saw him as someone who did speak the truth. And he did. It's just once he became president, you can't just say whatever you want when you're president. Or can you? And lastly, with politics, this is kind of redundant, but being a good orator served as a navigation tool for public policy. for both figures, even though Frederick Douglass wasn't technically a politician. He was an abolitionist who held a lot of power and influence. The second and last theme here is slavery. So what I found reading this book is that slavery, in the proximity to the issue of slavery, is the connection between these two. It's also the connection between these two and the U.S. Civil War. Slavery is at the core of this story, both of their stories. So morally, and here's the thing, when we're talking about slavery, morally speaking, it's obviously wrong. It's obviously wrong. And when Harriet Beecher Stowe published Uncle Tom's Cabin, everyone got to see the horrible things that were happening. And of course, their first instinct is to say that's so wrong. Morally is different than what we're going to get to in another point. But Frederick Douglass himself, his account of his time enslaved that reinforced, the horrors that were going on there. Lincoln always had a moral stance against slavery. He was like that before he became a politician, before he became president. And he rose in the Republican Party as anti-slavery. That was something that he never hid it. And one more moment. When we're talking about the Republican Party versus the Democratic Party, or Democrat Party, when I mention those two topics in reference to this book and this timeline and this episode, I need us all to understand something. The Republican Party and the Democrat Party at this time period in the 1860s are not the same as what they are now. They kind of switched at some point, and that can be another episode that we can talk about it. But so just so you know, Lincoln was a part of the Republican Party, but they're not the same Republican Party from 2023. Just so we're all clear. And lastly, when we're talking about the morality of slavery, Charles Sumner, who was actually beaten for speaking out against slavery, he was he a senator or a representative? I know he was a politician, and he was in one of the chambers of Congress, and an opponent actually beat him like really badly for speaking out against slavery. And this was pre-Civil War, I believe. It was before it actually started. So he's someone that morally was against slavery as well, and he is explicitly positioned as a link between both Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln. Now, there had to be a moderate perspective when we're talking about slavery, because even for the white people that lived in the North, they had to feel comfortable enough with the idea of freeing the enslaved people. So you couldn't really be as extreme. An example of being too extreme for the Northern whites was John Brown and the whole situation at Harper's Ferry, which completely, it didn't work out. You could argue that he was for freeing the enslaved people, but he went about it very wrong, and it made a lot of people uncomfortable. And in the years after, in the months after, the weeks after, he was looked at as treacherous and a traitor to his country. So that's the reason the moderate perspective had to be applied here, and this is where things start to get a little bit sticky. So when we're talking the early 1860s, Lincoln is coming into office as the leader of this country. He now has to think in terms of public policy and what he can actually put into practice. So I know it's easy for everyday people to think that whoever is running things, whoever the president is, can just make a decision and that be it. But the government was actually designed so that does not happen, and that a decision has to be vetted by multiple people or bodies of the government, which would be Congress. So it's not like he can make a quick decision and say, free the slaves, free the enslaved people. It doesn't work like that. He has to go through various hurdles and convince people Because what happened was being anti-slavery became a call to war for the Southerners because they're fighting to keep their status quo. That's how things worked for them. And for someone to come into office and federally say, oh, y'all can't keep those people enslaved, they're taking that as, all right, well, then we're going to fight you for it because this is how important it is to us. So there's actually an early iteration of the Emancipation in 1861 by a general under Lincoln, General Fremont, who actually ordered property of captured Confederate sympathizers. He ordered that to be seized, and he was basically saying, if we take over your territory in your state, your enslaved people are freed now. Lincoln didn't approve of it because the issue is no longer about slavery, but a policy that can be kind of touted to the North. He had to get the North to agree. So when the war first started, and kind of even into 1862, 1863, he is towing a very thin line because the Southerners are rebelling and the Northerners, although they, most of them are saying, yeah, slavery is bad, you can't risk kind of putting them over the edge. So you can't say, yeah, we're going to free these enslaved people and we're going to treat them equally. Oh, no. That was too much for the northern whites. So what ended up happening was he didn't do anything. He didn't make a decision for a while. So, and he actually ordered that General Fremont actually cancel that, take it down. And he kind of got technical with it, which when you put it into technical military terms, it makes sense. Basically, he can't just make a decision like that on behalf of the federal government. He can't do that. So, yeah, but that was an early iteration of the Emancipation Proclamation. What happened was the Emancipation Proclamation was Lincoln's last card. So like I mentioned in the beginning, the Union was not doing good for a good portion of that war. So what happened was he issued a call to arm the freedmen, and that would give them the edge in the war. Because you got to understand, both sides are losing a lot of people. And then a light bulb goes off, and he's like, well, at the insistence of Frederick Douglass, and he's like, wow, if we just, tell the enslaved people that, yeah, you're free, and if you come up to the North, we'll give you some guns and stuff, and you can fight for us. As a war tactic, duh. If you're losing so many people, you need more people to fight with you. But that's also how he kind of was able to get away with issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, because he said to the Northerners, and people were still not happy with it, by the way, but he said to them that basically, look, they're going to fight for us. So, and we're not doing that well. So we need them. And that's what happened. Lincoln was described in the last few chapters of the book as a pragmatic problem solver, but he never had a clear solution, because to him, that would just come. He knew that the solution would come, but he had to be pragmatic about it in the beginning. Which, you can't argue against that. That's basic politician talk. You got to be pragmatic, and you have to be able to sell something, not on emotion, but on what it can do for us and the majority of the people, is what it is. Now, beyond slavery, so expounding on that point a little bit more about Northerners, they saw freeing Black people from slavery as a precursor to equality. And that was just pushing it too far for them. They were like, so what are we going to do now after we free them? We going to treat them equally? Oh, no, we can't do that. Which they were right in hindsight. But so Lincoln had to basically remove equality from the policy of the Emancipation Proclamation. So that wasn't really a part of it. And he also said there was one meeting where he basically was just like, look, we white and Black people are not on the same level, but I'm willing to free you. He said that out of his mouth. So, but he was trying to placate the Northerners. So he had to basically treat slavery and equality as separate issues in order to push the Emancipation Proclamation. So was this a reread? For me, no. And I'll tell you why. It did encourage me, though, to seek the biography of Lincoln, and there's several different works on Frederick Douglass that were actually written by him. So it encouraged me to seek those out, but I will not be rereading this book because I feel like I did not like the pairing of these two. It almost didn't make sense to me. I do think that obviously you can argue that the connection between the two was their relation to slavery. But honestly, it's like you can almost take Frederick Douglass out of this and you can take Abraham Lincoln out of this and you can put two similar figures in their position and the book, the narrative will still stay the same. Obviously, like the growing up and stuff may change, but like for example, you can make this book about Charles Sumner and or you could use like William Lloyd Garrison as like a fill-in for Douglass, or you can use another politician that was anti-slavery in Abraham Lincoln's place. My point here is this, and this is coming after I read The Sword and the Shield, and that was about Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. For them, their connection was their proximity to the civil rights movement. The difference, however, is that we were able to tell, or Peniel E. Johnson was able to tell their stories separately when their timelines intersected, and it wasn't like, oh, Malcolm did this and Martin said this in reaction to that, and then Malcolm said this in reaction to that. That was certainly a part of their story, but that wasn't the whole thing. That wasn't the whole book. This book started to feel like you would read something that Abraham Lincoln said, and then the next few paragraphs would be, oh, and in response to that, Frederick Douglass said this. That's not enough for me. So, and an example of that, of this reactionary narrative, is that in 1862, Lincoln proposed to export Black people rather than end slavery. So he was like, look, we'll send you to a different country. And that was his way of kind of finagling freeing the slaves so that he could keep the country together. But the next few paragraphs detailed Douglass's response to that. And it's like, here's the thing. We know why Abraham Lincoln is a historical figure that is still being talked about today. We know that. We know why Frederick Douglass is a historical figure that is still being talked about today. We know that. Them living at the same time period and being seemingly on the same side of anti-slavery is not enough for them to have a book together. For me, it fell flat in a lot of sense for me. It was engaging learning about their upbringings, it was. But once we got into, once Frederick Douglass kind of stumbled into being an abolitionist, it kind of was like we didn't really need to hear about Lincoln's life because he wasn't doing much during that time period, and we were just talking about how he was still anti-slavery. And then Frederick Douglass kind of took a back seat, and Abraham Lincoln's presidency, obviously it was a big deal, was discussed and described. But then again, you would get Frederick Douglass's response to this speech that Lincoln did, or his response to his inaction, and that's not enough for me for them to be talked about in the same book. It just doesn't seem like there's much of a connection beyond the fact that they were both anti-slavery. And they had a few run-ins. I think they met 3 times maybe face to face, and there were moments when Frederick Douglass almost advised Abraham Lincoln on a few of his decisions. But there were also other advisors. There were also other abolitionists that could fill the place of this book. So I don't know exactly what I'm trying to say. I can't say it in one sentence, but I do know that I did not like these two figures being talked about in one book. I just feel like they're standalone. And it may just be because I read The Sword and the Shield, and it was written so well that there was never a moment where I was thinking, why am I reading this paragraph? It doesn't really add anything to the story. Like, what are we talking about here? And these two figures, again, we know why. We know why they're important to the US and what they did. But it just feels like we randomly just put them together because they were alive at the same time and they seemingly were on the same side. It's not enough. The connections to each other was too weak for me. I didn't like it. I kind of like broke it down to more simpler terms that this is not really a book about Lincoln and Douglas. It's a book about the government versus slavery, with Lincoln obviously representing the government and Douglas representing slavery. I think that if this book was titled, the U.S. government's, no, the U.S., what's the subtitle here? The U.S. government and its battle to save America's soul, I would like that better, because then obviously Lincoln is a key player in the U.S. government during this time period. There were a few other politicians that were key players. There were a few other generals that were mentioned in this book, but it's like, it just felt lazy to me to put them together just because. I don't know. I would love to hear what anyone else thinks. But my only takeaway here is, and this is about the passing of the Emancipation Proclamation, was that you have to have a pragmatic solution in order to put something out there. And after reading the 48 Laws of Power, you act on action, not on arguments, and you don't appeal to anyone's emotions. Because again, morally, the majority of the people living back then knew that slavery was wrong morally. Half of them had slaves that were their livelihood, that was their economic income. Half of them were in the North not wanting someone that was, just working the fields come up and take their job. So you got to find a pragmatic solution, which is not going to satisfy you morally. It's not, because it's not going to be a moral decision, but you got to find a way to implement it. And that's not going to be based on emotions. And that's politics for you. So that is all for today. I hope everyone is having a good week, and I will see you next week. Thank you.